Welcome to the Startup Competitors Podcast, where we talk with early-stage entrepreneurs to understand what information they use to inform product roadmap, strategy, and market differentiation.
All right, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Kelly. Today we have Jim Martin with Venue Intelligence. Jim, welcome to the podcast, man.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. How about we start off with a quick overview of Venue Intelligence, what you guys do?
Sure. So Venue Intelligence is largely a SaaS firm. We also provide some consulting services, but we're focused on SaaS solutions to enhance the security, operations, and marketing of large venues and live events. Our first product that we came to market with, Mike, was called Playbook. Playbook is a native app available in the web store, or rather in the iOS store and for Google Play. And it's really focused on live event managers, large venue owners who are looking to build and then distribute their emergency plans, their event plans, their maps, their contacts, all from one location out to their staff, their volunteers, and their first responders. You know, a lot of times what we find is that's the sort of content that is held captive in a binder somewhere. And frankly, in this day and age that we live in, it is increasingly important that that information is available at somebody's fingertips. And today it's simply not. There's a lot of time, energy, and effort for those organizations that do tend to collect and organize that information. And quite frankly, it's a shame to put it on a bookshelf somewhere.
Yeah, and I know you don't always like to talk about some of the very specific real cases where your software gets used, and I understand why. They're not normally fun topics, but active shooter events, fires at stadiums, anytime where real-time information in the hands of either first responders or crew members who are and staff who are there to help people get to safety or exit safely. I mean, that is the use case, right?
Yeah, it's really an interesting time, and maybe that's a bad adjective, in which we live, over the course of the past 10 to 15 years. Really this convergence, as I call it, of security and event managers specifically having to work together. That wasn't necessarily the case, frankly, prior to the Boston Marathon bombing, which was a catalytic event, if you will, in that specific industry. There have been others just in this past year. When you think about what's going on at Vegas, you think about the nightclub deal. To your point, we could spend the next 2 hours just dissecting, unfortunately, and very sad and tragic events that occur. And as much as I hesitate to say it, by the time this goes live, the statistics bear out there will be another one. And in all likelihood, it'll be a school shooting. And I hate to say that, but this business was not launched based on those stats. This business was launched based on my observation of, again, a lot of hard work that goes into the creation of these plans, and not only the inaccessibility, oftentimes, not in every case, but oftentimes, the inaccessibility of these plans, but moreover, the disconnect from a communication standpoint that tends to occur between event directors and or venue owners and the first response community. I was just visiting with a police chief yesterday who was talking about his priorities for the year in this new role that he is in. And the very first thing that he said was relationships. He said, we not only deal with so much turnover on his staff, but it's the ongoing care and feeding that is required of these relationships at senior levels. The organization that I worked for prior to starting Venue Intelligence did a masterful job of really forcing the field managers of these large asset shopping centers, to be specific, to meet with their police chief, to meet their first response, kind of the tip of the spear group, prior to game day, prior to running around with your hair on fire. That is not the time to be trying to initiate a relationship in the parking lot of your facility or in the parking lot of your event. So, again, going back to the Boston Marathon, we were part of an after-action session that was really kind of a seminal moment for that industry that was conducted by a group called NCS4, which is the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security down out of southern Mississippi. And one of the comments that the facilitator made after that event was, these people know their industry cold. They can run events in their sleep, literally and figuratively. But they don't know what they don't know as it relates to safety and security. Their mantra was, we know how to run events between the sidewalks. We've never had to think about what's going on the other side of the sidewalk.
All right. Don't want to dwell on that stuff. That's not the fun stuff.
Well, and so let me jump in on that, because that's a great point. That we have a lot of customers that not only don't want to dwell on it, aren't necessarily prepared to dwell on those things. And I don't mean that as though they're taking a head in the sand approach to the business. But quite frankly, because of the way we've set up this system, it can also be used as an event management tool. So I like to say, look, in a couple of keystrokes, part of the magic here is that you have your event plans right next door to your security plan. So to clarify that, I used to meet with a number of marketing directors at the same time I would have a security resource individual in the room.
Yeah.
And oftentimes she would have her marketing director would have her run of show, as they called it, or the event plan and all the things that were important to her pulling this thing off. He or she on the security side may have simply a staffing plan. The ability to kind of commingle that stuff is critically important. And it's not rocket science, right? It's let's get it in the same place. So if I need to have the event plan and I'm an emergency guy, or I need to have the emergency plan and I'm a volunteer, and volunteer management opens up an entirely new conversation as it relates to this specific issue, because you're talking about, unlike staff who may be familiar with your plan because I do this for a living, I'm at this event every year, I'm in this building as an employee. When you're talking about volunteer management, these are people that have a day job. These are people that might be 15 years old. They might be 80 years old, and they're showing up because they like golf and they want to be at a golf tournament. They don't know the first thing about CPR, where the AED is located, what to do in the case of weather that's consistent with a plan that's been written. So the ability, frankly, as simple as it sounds, to bring together the event, here's the plan for the day. But as I say, I've also got the scary stuff, the what if stuff. And it's the what if stuff that when minutes matter, you can't be looking around for who's got the playbook. You got to have a playbook in your pocket. And that's where we feel it's so compelling to have it on your phone as opposed to anywhere else.
Yeah.
We deal with people all the time. It's almost comical when I look at, I know we'll get into this with regard to competitors. I look at little flip books, laminated flip books that have spiral bound, that are amazingly about the size of an iPhone 8, right?
I'm holding one here in my hand since we're at Venue Intelligence World headquarters. You have some of these.
That's right. That's right. And you could flip through that and you can see, A, not only how close it is in size, but B, the almost comical aspect of that is I dealt with a major marathon in the Chicago area. They have those printed up and then they attach a lanyard to it. So it's a pocket guide to which they attach a lanyard and hang it around their volunteer's neck. Now, to me, I've always been sensitive, again, back to my mall days and I just had this conversation yesterday with another police officer. Their belts are really full of stuff.
Right.
Right. There's no available real estate. And this is not a Paul Blart Mall Cop shot. Their belts don't have any additional room. There's no additional space. Why not take full advantage of this computer that we use to make phone calls, right? And have it all right there.
Why don't you hit us with some current status? Just for somebody who's listening who may not be familiar with the company, can you paint a picture of kind of where you are on the journey in terms of, size of the team, revenue, anything you can share that'll just kind of make it real for somebody who might be trying to place where you are on the journey so they can see how much of what you share kind of applies to where they're at?
Sure. So you referenced my global headquarters in which you're sitting, and I wish the echo were more significant because it's pretty tiny. I joke with people that I used to have hair like Eric Estrada, and for your younger listeners, I would say hair like Justin Bieber. It's been a long journey thus far. We launched product in 2015. After spending about a year or so really kind of thinking through roadmap and really thinking through what's the lowest hanging fruit, what are the greatest pain points that we can hit, obviously to develop an MVP.
Yeah.
And I was not only pleasantly surprised with the outcome of those efforts, somewhat internally, meaning pre-launch, but then to go to market with something that was so, revolutionary might be a smidge of an overstatement, but the reaction that I was getting from the market was not MVP. Those folks in the market don't know what that acronym means necessarily. Now, that is not to say that we're on the verge of going public. The reaction was that there's nothing really out here in the marketplace quite like this. Now, we can go into, is that a good or bad statement?
Yeah.
Right. But as it relates to where we're at in the journey, so, 3 years in, I remain a pretty virtual organization, and part of that's per plan. And part of that is just due to pragmatism, meaning the funding. So the plan part of that is this is a great opportunity for me to be able to leverage interns on a regular basis. There are certainly some safety plans that we are asked to load in on behalf of our customers. And I would cite the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500. That was highly classified, for lack of a better term. It's called FOUO, which is for official use only documentation. That's not the type of document I'm going to lay out in front of a high school or college intern for really data entry and cleaning it up so that it looks pretty on the phone. But there's real value to our customer to have our interns do that. Likewise, there's value to the intern, because for those people that are interested in seeing how does a big event run, they can certainly go to the event. But for a look inside the kimono, they need not look any farther than what's the run of show look like. I mean, when we did the 500, it was fascinating to see what really went into the plan. Right. And that was just the plan. Forget about all the emergency stuff. That was crazy. And as a regular attendee, just John Q. Public going out to that thing, to know what goes on behind the scene, it gives you much greater appreciation than what you hear in the sound bites coming out of the race.
Right.
But again, back to the journey. So we have certainly landed many, many exciting clients with some big brands. It's a fun business to be a part of from the standpoint of there aren't many people and many organizations or many events that don't have a need. I'm biased. I'm drinking my own Kool-Aid when I say this. But if you're going to look me straight in the face and tell me we don't need a plan for what if, I mean, it doesn't have to be as dramatic as active shooter. We can be talking about weather events. I go to conferences all the time, and weather is almost a given. Beyond weather, the given is you're going to lose a kid. I was at the USA National Marathon Show last year, road race show, and they were going through all these various scenario role plays. And somebody stood up at the end of the meeting, having spent all this time on weather and some active shooter packages that have been left behind, just various scenarios they played out. We had 10 minutes left, and the fella said, what we've not gotten to is the one thing that happens to all of us, and that's you're going to lose a kid. You don't need to be in this business for 5 years. Your first year, you will lose a child. So let's talk about reunification and that process a little bit. Again, another great buy signal for me to show how we can leverage something that's already in the pocket of your vetted volunteers.
Right.
Radios are really expensive, and I go to training after training, and I volunteer a lot. And yeah, if you're a volunteer, quote, chief, which I guess means you have a vest or a hat in addition to your T-shirt, you may be given an $800 radio. I work with somebody here who worked out at the BMW Championship, and she was ringing merchandise at the merchandise tent. I was out on hole 16 as the VIP access control guy. Again, I have a day job. I was given a little bit of training. I was not given a radio. She was not given a radio. She's checking a guy, ringing a guy up at the register, and he has cardiac arrest. His cardiac arrest right there. I know the prices are high at the merchandise tent, but this was completely, he's down and out, and she's a little panicky, as are the people around her. She bolts out the door, and she's trying to find somebody with a radio. Thankfully, the person was fine. They ended up being fine, but that's because they got an AED to them. If you talk to people who know anything about AEDs, you got about a 3 or 4 minute window before exponential brain loss starts to occur. You can start CPR, but until you reestablish a sinus rhythm, CPR is not going to do the job in the 3 to 4 minute mark. You keep them going as long as you can. Point being, we all went through the same training. This gal took the same training I did. There was never really a discussion of, hey, there's an AED right over here on this side of the tent. That had she not been able to find somebody, in my opinion, it would have been her job to get to that AED. To drop an AED map of any facility, that's relatively static. This isn't content, that has to be touched. And I get that, right? I've been in that conversation where everybody takes a big, deep sigh in the process and procedure meeting because it's the care and feeding of the content that, oh my gosh, he wants to be doing this every week. A lot of these plans are relatively static. They get touched maybe once a year for a major marathon. I mean, they'll go through the process. I don't mean to shoehorn everybody into that same category, but they're going to do an after action immediately following the event, and then they're going to start the next day on next year's event. I don't want to suggest that it's not difficult in that particular industry, but the plans, once they get locked, they're going to reuse a lot of what they've used in the past. There's no reason for a lot of these folks to reinvent the wheel.
All right. So you mentioned before the Indy 500, and I know you've done the Rio Olympics, mm-hmm. and you've done some events overseas, and you've done all of the marathons. Talk a little bit about some of the other customers or events or venues where you've been engaged, the ones that you can talk about anyway. What does a customer look like for you, or a vertical look like for you? Where are you guys trying to go to market right now? Yeah,
we're really excited about a variety of verticals. And my pause there was, I don't know if I fully answered your where are we on the journey question. I'm happy to go back and share.
The logos will also kind of tell.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
I don't know many startups that have worked with the Olympics. and been used on the ground at the Olympics. So it's, it's a good little bragging moment.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just explaining to my son that the pipeline is I put it in a baseball analogy. It's how many at bats, right, and quality at bats, and how many foul tips versus swings and misses versus connections are we making, and good contact outs that ultimately become base hits and maybe even doubles and triples, right? When you look at something like some of the names you've mentioned, there's no question that you're kind of swinging for the fences on some of those big guys, and it's sales 101, right? We all know, the pipeline and what that has to look like to get to those big ones, and sometimes it's no different than what I'm sure my peers out there have experienced in terms of just that relentless cadence that you're trying to establish with somebody who is truly a decision maker versus somebody who can just say no. They can't say yes. They can certainly say no. It's that getting to yes, right, as the book says. In 17, we spent a lot of energy on the marathon space, the road race space. We're talking about, I want to say, in upwards of, I believe it's 20,000 road races a year. And those, it's one thing, Mike, when you're talking about trying to secure a building like a shopping center or a convention center, which is not easy. We've been very fortunate as a culture, and I'll leave that comment as it stands. But when you're trying to secure 26 miles, we have clients that they start their race in one state and it ends in another state. The amount of coordination from a law enforcement, first responder, volunteer, it is massive. And so back to my comment, it's a 52-week job. I joke with these event directors that they'll have people come up and say, so, what was your time in your race this year? The people will think that a race director actually runs in their own race. It's a full-time job, and it's grown even more complicated for reasons that we're discussing right now. I would take something like the Pittsburgh Marathon or the Little Rock Marathon, to pick on that one industry for a moment, and say, those are organizations in my mind that clearly get it. They've taken, and we see this natural kind of iteration or maturation with customers that stay with us, that we retain, that is, over the course of 1, 2, 3 years. And that is this. That first year, they really look at implementing their content kind of statically. In other words, they're not going to use it as a platform, as a living, breathing document that, hey, there are changes day of, morning of. When we did the Brickyard, this was kind of one of those first aha moments of, hey, this is how we can really communicate super effectively with a lot of volunteers. Now, any hesitation you hear in my voice anytime I talk about the IMS just relates to connectivity. When we first built this program, the idea in the app was this has to work offline. It's going to compete with a binder. We're going to have it in venues the size of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, ideally. Right. There's a ton of saturation on the cell network. Wi-Fi is likely not going to work for turn 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this thing it can't be a brick. It's got to work. And so obviously we cache that information on the phone, and that's a big hit. Now, it's a double-edged sword, because if I have connectivity, it is awesome, because you have the opportunity now to create those changes. So back to the Brickyard, a few years ago, this is part of the catalyst for why they're moving the race to later in the year. The heat was so excessive that the morning of the Brickyard, they changed their ice vendor policy 3 times. And that is, who are we going to let in? What kind of ice vendors? Because it was so hot, they were throwing the rules out the door, and that's me paraphrasing.
I'm sorry, there's a ice vendor policy.
There's an ice vendor policy. Like, they were bringing in vendors from, as I understand it, essentially off the street. If they had ice to sell, they were going to credential them at the door and bring them in. That was a very real-time adjustment they were making. Yeah. That doesn't push well out over email after rolled-up thread on rolled-up thread. On the other hand, when your phone goes off because there's been a change to your playbook, you swipe it, boom, here it is. Awfully effective. Let me give you one that's a little bit more close to home for dads. Right? Yeah. I was here in Zionsville, and arguably safest community in the country. Maybe not even arguably. They have their nice little fall festival every year. It's Americana 101, man. It's literally apple pie, Chevrolet, maybe some baseball down the street on the other side, right? But they lose kids. Kids wander off. It's happened since the beginning of time. And maybe not the beginning of time, but you get the point. Those kids didn't come back, right? It was the
tiger got
them. You got it.
Yes.
A natural selection. These kids thankfully came back, but I saw 2 officers go blown by on bikes, and they were just yelling out to the crowd that they had lost a girl. There was a lost girl. Now, I talked to the police afterwards, and you and I both know instinctively that is less than ideal, suboptimal, we would call that, because even in Zionsville, per the police, there are people that they don't want to know that there's a lost girl walking around.
Right.
We live in that world. The ability for the Little Rock Marathon, who actually had a command trailer set up, which is standard operating procedure for these marathons, to be able to get a picture of the girl, drop it in a playbook, push it out to only the vetted employees who, by the way, didn't have radios, but they all had phones and they had playbook. You talk about minutes mattering. It's one thing when it's an AED. It's another thing when it's your child. Both
Right.
important, but just on a different scale altogether. That's really powerful. And so my comment that you get some races and some organizations that kind of use it as in place of the binder, static. And then you get others that really get into the notification aspect and use it more as an operating system for their event. That's really cool. And that tells me that they've fully embraced where this thing can go. And those are the folks that we obviously get the best feedback for in terms of roadmap items.
So let's switch gears real quick and let's start talking about competition. So when you think of competitors for maybe venue intelligence, maybe just playbook, I'll let you choose kind of which flavor you want to take there. Because I know there's always been a bigger vision for venue intelligence and other products and things that you can do, especially within stadiums and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think of when you think of competition? How do you think of competition for the market that you're in?
Sure. So I'll give you the perspective of when I first wrote the business plan and now a few years in. So we certainly cited the fact that there's a big bucket of players in the emergency management software space. I have purchased those products before. I've rolled them out at hundreds of venues in the shopping center industry. Similarly, there's an equally as large bucket, arguably typically not as expensive, on event management software. Not a lot of overlap, quite frankly. They're very different disciplines for reasons I've already cited. Lastly, there's the document management piece. And as we all know, there's a lot of players in that space, some of which are not only inexpensive, but free. I'm a big fan personally of something like Dropbox. And then, of course, there's the almighty Excel spreadsheet.
Excel does all of those things.
It does everything. We don't, who needs access? So we to answer your question, we run predominantly into something like an Excel spreadsheet that is then converted into a PDF and printed and turned into a binder. So there's a lot of offline status quo business as usual because that's what they're most comfortable with, and it comes down to change a version. A lot of times it's not. Yes, there are certainly customers that come back and say that's a little bit too salty of a price point. But I also have others in other key industries like the meeting planners business, the convention center business, where I will share with you just quickly and anecdotally that in the top 3 concerns in that industry right now, safety and security is a top one. I mean, there's a major initiative afoot right now of the major exhibition companies, organizations that are coming together to form their own safety and security committee because there's a complete lack of standards across the board. And that is really problematic. So now it's not just about, hey, we're going to shop indie for the restaurants and for the hotels, but the question is becoming, how do you keep our people safe when we choose Indy over Austin? So again, those are the 3 big software buckets that I would view as being the most competitive. We certainly, when we're dealing with pure event managers versus venue managers, I do run into a lot of folks that seem to get confused over, well, I've got a volunteer registration system. We are not that. As a matter of fact, that's a great partner opportunity for us. And we look to those channel partners to say, look, where you've got a volunteer management system, let's add on Playbook to this, because what you're doing is you're getting people signed up, but what you're not giving them is the takeaway, which should be, here's not only the event plan, but here's the safety plan. We have a really unique opportunity, as I like to say, to take your what we call Ask Me volunteer and turn them into a very important asset in the event of something going wrong. Ask Me volunteers are kind of a thing, right? You see these events where they got the big question mark over their head, as well as turning the police officer, frankly, into a customer service volunteer. The story I like to share, we rolled this out in beta, and I've told you this before, but it was during the Super Bowl, and up and down this street to be named later.
Just the Super Bowl.
Right, just the Super Bowl.
Name drop.
Right. We were rolling it out with IMPD, and we did the after action with IMPD afterwards. And I said, so tell me how you used Playbook. Give me some examples. Or if you didn't, why not? What you didn't find it useful. And the first fella who gave us something to think about, he said, there's a fella from Iowa. I'm not sure it matters where he was from necessarily, but he came up, he said, look, we were, I'm confusing my big events here, Mike. the Iowa was the Big Ten championship, actually, where this guy. So sorry, not trying to name drop too much, but I want to make sure the listeners aren't saying, "No, wait, this was before you launched." The Super Bowl was 2012, Jim. Validity check, Mike. Come on.
That's fair. All right.
So we'll call it the Big Ten championship.
Big Ten Brian Williams moment.
Right. That's exactly right. I jumped out of the helicopter, bullets everywhere. The cop rolls up to this fella, and the guy's basically looking. He had heard that there was going to be a shrimp eating contest. Well, we all know as locals that that's probably occurring at St. Elmo's, but you don't know for sure. The cop was asked, what time is it? Where's it going to be? And he didn't have the agenda for the day's events on him. He said, it's probably back in my cruiser on my laptop, but it's a quarter mile away. I'm not going back. And he said, no, you know what? Hang on a second. I got this new app on my phone. Let's see if it's in here. Well, sure enough, here's not only the schedule, but he said, hey, Joey Chestnut is going to be signing autographs ahead of time. Joey Chestnut is the ranking hot dog eating champion, Coney Island, every year, 4th of July sort of thing, right? Who knew?
Doesn't know
but
that?
This cop knew, right? That's the point. Suddenly he's a walking directory, right? Not only is your shrimp eating contest at 3:15, but you have an opportunity to get an autograph. Small example, one guy interacting with one police officer in Indianapolis. But when I go to visit Indy, who is the champion of carrying the flag for this city in terms of bringing in events and winning events, those are stories that add up over time.
One of the things you mentioned in there that was interesting, I don't know if I've ever asked you this before. So you mentioned a possible channel partner, the volunteer registration app. You're in an interesting space where I imagine you could potentially have a lot of frenemies, right? So software providers who could be competitors, they could be partners. Just kind of depends on how that first conversation
I think
goes,
you're
right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about that. Like because I think, those three things, event management, security, document management, information management, like they are kind of broad, and there are a lot of players in those space. When you do sit down to talk with a potential partner, or when you think about competitors, how much of that is like, no, it's a giant market. This could be a great opportunity to partner versus winner take all.
Yeah. That's
and maybe that's maybe I'd totally be interested in your personal view on that. And then maybe some of your experience from the industry of like, what's your feel from the industry in terms of how they view that?
Yeah. So that's a thought-provoking question. Personally, I've probably ebbed and flowed rather substantially in the last 36 months in terms of, I'm not kidding myself that I'm not in a position to be winner take all. That's not due to lack of confidence, but the reality is that what we have built, while compelling, we're not curing cancer, right? And so there's certainly IP here. And while there might be prospective investors listening, I get that. But the reality is where we feel Venue Intelligence can go, to your earlier question, in terms of predictive analytics and making recommendation based on either machine learning or artificial intelligence to say that, look, we know you're a Division I college. How do you compare? It's kind of the LinkedIn example of, well, am I an all-star or am I an also-ran? Well, they're looking at how many connections and your picture and all these variables. We want to do the same thing with Playbook. You shouldn't have to go to a conference. You shouldn't have to, spend a tremendous amount of money. I'm all for continuing education, but you shouldn't have to do those things. If you can log into our system and you can see the templates that are already there for somebody who is you. You are the persona, of which there are thousands. And while we won't divulge that, hey, this is exactly what Purdue does, or this is exactly what Visit Indy does to protect the convention center, that opportunity to say, oh, here's a catalog of things for convention centers or shopping centers or hotels. Some repetition, but some really unique. A marathon, as I said, is very different than protecting a school. So I think as I have reached out to others, there's been what I view as an effort to create some thought leadership and some vision and some appetite for that partnership. And I'll tell you, man, it's fun. It's fun on both sides of the ledger. Some people, you feel like you're leading the horse to water. And I sit here after a call and I hang up and I'm like, man, they are either not getting it or they're like, what this guy's doing is pretty cool. Now they're walking down the hall to their CTO to say, how do we build this in? I mean, I can tell you honestly.
We do this.
Right, yeah. Right. And again, it's not because it was easy to do it. It's still going to cost them money. But I'd be lying to you if I were to suggest some of these emails that I've sent to CEOs of these firms, that's been my biggest boogeyman in the closet is, are they going to just turn around and go silent and go develop their own playbook? Because it is a natural extension of the security type of software that's out there. It's a natural extension of many of the event planning softwares out there, but it drastically changes their messaging. And to me, that's where the partnering opportunity comes to bear. So personally, it's a little bit threatening. Again, no perspective on Jim Martin's part that I'm in a winner-take-all position just because of where we sit as a smaller guy. The only other soundbite I'd have there is from a professional standpoint, there's some really big boys. We've looked to partner with some security firms where I feel very strongly that being able to walk in with Playbook on your hip to a venue owner when you're trying to win the business as a security services firm to say, I want to put my guy in your shop. And by the way, we're also bringing this technology to bear. I think that's a powerful thing to be able to say, but it's been hard to have that breakthrough, honestly. I think that particular industry, while they've adopted and they've begun to embrace a lot more technology, my observation over a dozen years in the shopping center industry is they're not, the margins are thin, and so they're amazingly price conscious. But they have to differentiate themselves in some way because otherwise it's a commodity business. It's just, what am I paying per guy? But it's been tough to have a breakthrough with those folks. Again, the thought leadership has been a challenge.
How often do you do a search you've been at this for 3 years. When you look back over those 3 years in retrospective, I'd be interested in how many new kind of direct competitors do you feel have entered the market in those 3 years? And then how often are you kind of poking your head up? Because you're in it, right? You're doing sales every day. You're doing customer support. You're doing everything, right? Like you are in it. So it's hard to kind of zoom out and take a fresh look at the market. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how often do you do that? What have you seen over the last 3 years? And then when you do that, do you kind of have a process that you use, or do you just have a normal set of places that you look, or is it a little more event driven? Like somebody else brings it up in the sales process? Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I probably don't do it as frequently as I do. We have a very seasonal and cyclical business, which I'd love to see us flatten out. Again, the racing industry, as you might expect, it's somewhat related to geography. Obviously, races go off a little bit earlier down south than they do up north, short of the polar bear plunge and the likes of those. When we do slow down and I have a chance to catch a breath, I certainly go out, and there's some resources out there that do a fine job of not only kind of rolling up who are the competitors in this space, but doing some assessments of, hey, here's the overall quality ratings, almost consumer reports of the event management services that are out there, which has certainly been helpful. There's no question from time to time I'll be in a conversation with a prospect or current customer or just a friend, and they'll be like, hey, I saw so-and-so. Is that what you do? And so some of it's anecdotal, and you walk out there and you'll be like, holy cow, how did I, where was I? How did I miss this thing? And that gives you pause. When you miss one of those, you're like, well, then who else am I missing? And I think part of that's just human nature. So I'd love to tell you I have a better process, Mike, than I do, but I don't. I think that...
hey, man, you're not alone. After like 30 episodes of this podcast, you're not alone. Don't sweat that. You're all good.
Yeah. So
there's been 2 answers out of 30 where they're like, oh yeah, process every quarter. Really?
Well, and again, these things get stood up and shut down with such frequency. I can't speak to the frequency of the shutdowns, but you swear you saw something and you can no longer find that company out there, or they've morphed. There's so much pivoting that goes on. As I said, our desire to have venue intelligence be certainly much more than just Playbook. We think Playbook is incredibly compelling, but the catalyst for starting the business was crowd simulation technology and predictive analytics for these large venues and these events, because predicting the what if, and it is Georgia Street, by the way. Thank you. It was Georgia Street. Woo-hoo. Sorry, I'm not sure about the nice block there. It's the Friday afternoon malaise setting in, I guess.
It's all good, man.
Right? The ability to answer, you play the way you practice. Well, how do you practice with 50,000 people? You don't. Right. And it's a frightening thing. And I don't care if it's a drone flying overhead. You can talk about the outlier of the Indianapolis 500 all you want, trying to evacuate that, or a FIFA soccer match. There's really no elegant answer. But when you start evaluating,
I was at a 20,000 person concert, which is in the world of concerts is not that big. Mm-hmm. I was at a 20,000 person concert last weekend for entirely too long. And I was actually thinking while I was there, I was thinking of you, and I was thinking of Playbook. And
we spent too much time together. I'm sorry. I hope that didn't wreck your event.
No, it was great.
I can't go to a movie theater anymore.
But I'm standing there in the middle of a crowd, right? Because it's one stage, even though it's like a ton of bands, it's a whole weekend thing. But it's one stage, and I'm standing there in the middle of the crowd, and we're basically in a big giant fishbowl, right? Like there's fences that are keeping the crowd in kind of one area, and I'm just thinking well, what happens if there's a tornado that pops up?
Right.
We're in the Midwest. It's
absolutely
spring-ish.
Spring pop-up storms all the time. Sure.
What happens if there's an active shooter? What happens if somebody, and we actually, it was a punk concert, so people got hurt. So we did get to see how medical response worked. but like I was thinking about all of those things and then running in my head, like, well, what would I do? Do any of these volunteers know what they're doing? Or any of the people working the event, do they know what they're doing?
Right.
How do you move 20,000 people if you need to? Like all that kind of stuff, right?
So that's right.
So when you think of crowd simulation, for me, it's like, yeah, like are people going to scatter? Are they going to herd and move as a group? Are they, like what happens?
Well, and you think about the wireless, technology that's out there, and some of the things that, again, not only you can do by leveraging AI and the machine learning aspects of it. Simulation technology has been around a long time. Again, I got exposed to it on the build side of shopping centers. Oftentimes, that's the view that comes in when you're going to pour $185 million into a shopping center. What's this thing going to do? What's it going to look like and feel like? A lot of people instinctively know that because they've been doing it for 20 years. What I always found the disconnect was, okay, we build this thing. There's no value to the actual operator for a tool like that. In other words, if you're going to do a concert inside a shopping center, just as an example, where might be the marketing opportunities or better operational aspects of queuing up a line this way? If we're going to talk about marketing and impressions, right, that we want to make, how many people are we predicting are going to be here? How are we going to bring these folks in? I realize it can be done, and it can be done by senior people with relative ease, but I was also privy to ones that went sideways in a hurry. When you're talking about, again, just from a pure marketing perspective, there's going to be a queue time. We can now estimate, and the track has to live with this reality of bag checks, right? We can estimate if we're going to do a new shoe giveaway or a Kelly Clarkson concert opening for Microsoft. We're bringing in 2,500 people. How do we bring those people in, and how do we maximize and optimize their exposure to the asset in a way that is going to be a good first impression and, even more importantly, a better final impression? When they're leaving the parking garage, I was with an operator earlier this year that informed me that it took them 3 hours to get their customer out of the parking garage after an event. Well, you can have a heck of an event, but if it's 3 hours in a car, heaven forbid you have children.
Right.
That's your last taste. That's the lasting impression of the event, and that is a bad deal. So yeah, crowd simulation, I think, is extremely exciting. How we move that type of product into an ARR, MRR type of holy grail, monetarily, was a bit of the head scratcher, as well as how do we build this in at a cost that we can then, sell it cost effectively. There's no question there's a secure or a consulting professional services business there, but I believe that there's absolutely a future between that and Playbook that can just help you validate, so that now I'm standing at said concert, right, where I'm the guy in charge. I've got weather radar. I can see that the storm's coming in 30 minutes. Well, and this is what's exciting to me, to be able to say, how long would it take me to shut down this thing right now, which nobody wants to do. That's when they're making their money. It's why you came. Nobody wants to do that. But to be able to say, look, to evacuate this crowd, well, we need 3 or 4 prompts. What's the average age? Half the people are intoxicated. Check that. 3/4 of the people are intoxicated. You get a few inputs, right? I've stood at a gate out at Conner Prairie where it's an angry sky in the middle of summer, and the crowd is 80 years old. I was the youngest guy in the crowd by quite a few decades. It was Golden Oldies night.
For that crowd, Jim, that's not a young crowd.
That crowd, to be able to get out of there, right, to make their way to the handicap spots, you need a lot longer time. Same head count,
right,
as your 20,000, but tap on 4 years. Not highly intoxicated, but maybe impaired for other reasons.
All right. So this is based a little bit on some past conversations, and I'll provide a little bit of context. And I truly, truly hope we can talk about this without making this a politics discussion.
Sure.
But in some recent events, there have been talk from whether it's school systems or states or at the federal level about what actions can we take for school shootings or any number of active shooter scenarios based on some of the craziness. And I know you dipped a toe recently just in terms of understanding what those conversations are and what actions, whether it's a federal program or state level, what could happen. And I also know, based on past conversations, that there's been some grant money that's been out there in the space for first responders and for software for first responders and things like that. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on, when you think of competition Do you ever think about, is the government going to stand up a playbook? That could potentially be a competitor, or will they pick a winner in the market and say, whether it's playbook or somebody else, will they pick a winner is it winner take all? Because in certain segments of what you do, the government could step in and say, no, this is the one we're using. Everybody get on board with this one. This is the one that's going to be on FirstNet, whatever.
Right.
I'd love your thoughts on, just based on some of the conversations you've had, things that you've listened to. I know you're like the one person who listened to like 8 hours of, I think, state level deliberation.
It's an exciting life I lead, Mike.
When you told me that, I was like, wait, you listened to the whole thing? What are you doing, dude?
It was an effective day.
But I'd love your thoughts on like what that does look like today and what you think that could look like.
Yeah. So quickly and apolitically, I would say I have about zero concern of the government building anything competent. And I say that tongue firmly implanted in cheek, in that from a speed to market standpoint, all the issues you would expect. Now, that said, what's really interesting to me about that question in part is the view of competition changes drastically when you talk about grant money, because, and I've had this conversation with countless people. I had a very, very blunt, as law enforcement tends to be with me, conversation with somebody in Homeland Security who said, look, it's your software or a bomb sniffing dog. Now, for the record, our price point is not the same, but that was his point, right? So I have to suddenly now compete with, because there's a finite amount of money.
I've only got X dollars.
I've got X dollars.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to tip my hand on where I think simulation technology could be used there, because I think that's a really fascinating play that'll be podcast 2.0 between us maybe in a year, right?
Got it.
The challenge of we had Congresswoman Susan Brooks here a few weeks ago. Immediately, actually, I think it was between Parkland and certainly well before what just occurred here in Noblesville. She was here for other reasons, but she's been very active in securing federal grant dollars for first responders, for emergency preparedness and the like, along with Luke Messer here locally. And, she made a comment that really resonated. Those numbers sound so big at the federal level, right? And as you probably know, Governor Holcomb reconvened a summer session to come back and get some additional business done. One of which was we need monies secured for state funding these types of initiatives from a school safety standpoint. $13.5 million across 92 counties, just with all the schools, and I forget what the count is here in the state. It just simply, at the end of the day, you do that math, it just does not go very far. And so you get into this, hey, I'd love an SRO, a school safety resource officer at every location, but is that a fully loaded $50,000, $65,000? Well, that times 92 counties alone, that's a one school per county. So my competitive landscape to get those grant dollars is extremely competitive. It's misleading. People hear the big numbers and they're like, Jim, you're in a great space. And I am. It's horribly unfortunate for those reasons that are generating those grants.
Right.
But the competitive landscape, suddenly now it's not just Dropbox that I'm competing. Suddenly it's, we're thinking about metal detectors or Playbook. Well, you buy my product 100 times over before it's going to add up to a metal detector, but you get the point. Only so much money.
Yeah. Have you heard of any, whether it's building automation or I don't necessarily mean to keep it with schools, but so you're more than, feel free to kind of range with this one if you need to or can. But when I think of schools, I think of like, Playbook and having, first responders having access to information on Playbook for the schools because they're not in those schools every day, right? Yeah. They're showing up and they're kind of blind. The ability to put real-time camera feeds into something like Playbook, if you're in a school and you have you have some of that stuff. And I know a little bit about building automation from some of our other work, and I know that a lot of building automation software is still on premise, on a computer, behind a firewall. Like it's not in the cloud, right? Like you're not streaming those cameras, at least on the fly.
By and large, it's not Jack Bauer 24.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So I think of those types of things. I think of is there any kind of macro level discussion that says, okay, we have some things within schools.
Yeah.
How do we make it more accessible or more real time? Because I don't think a lot of those things were designed for real time, right? Like
Correct.
when they put cameras in schools, they're thinking kids like me breaking in at night and like messing with the science class.
Yeah, there's a lot of post views of, I talk to investigators with some frequency, and they're a big fan of cameras because, well, we've got this for investigative purposes, which inherently suggests the post, after the event has occurred. I talk with people all the time. One of the challenges with metal detectors and cameras is that they're only as good as the monitoring. In other words, Carmel High School has 22 doors. There's no suggestion that they're going to go to metal detectors over there, by the way, but 22 doors with metal detectors and 3 safety resource officers. Well, what happens when you set off a metal detector? You'll note that at TSA at airports, there's always somebody there to stop you and make you take out your metal, right? So you're suddenly, when you run that to ground, it's the same thing with cameras. There's science that supports if you're watching more than 8 cameras for more than 12 minutes, you're going to have a gorilla jumping up and down on one of them and you're not going to see it because you just glaze over. So I've been through those trainings. I've been through those and you see those sorts of things. I will say this, that there are certainly some very expensive, fancy grant-funded solutions that have been out there that are in some of our school systems here locally. I was told by IMPD DHS early on in our launch that, had we been 2 years earlier, we would have been a part of that grant and we'd be off and running. We weren't. And so it's been a bit of a scrounge since then. But I share that because they have started to pull in maybe some through GIS systems here locally. They've started to reach out to the schools and pull in some of that so that's available. But you mentioned something I think is really important, and that's the FirstNet program, and that's for listeners' purposes. That's a combination of AT&T and this FirstNet government organization that have basically come together with the sale of the available spectrum. They've led a contract. AT&T won it for about $4.5 billion. They are going to be building a next-gen network that essentially auto-authenticates your phone as a first responder onto a network that is crazy uptime and crazy bandwidth capable. So when you talk about something like a playbook, and this was a conversation I had with the chief yesterday, my goal is to make sure that we are one of those baseline, let's get it in their app store, which is what they're calling it. So your phone wakes up now and today it says AT&T LTE or Verizon. Well, tomorrow for that select group of people that opt into FirstNet, which is a select group, it'll say FirstNet and it's going to be available everywhere. And they're the priority highway on the cellular network. Now, the caveat to the enthusiasm I have is that effort started during 9/11. Immediately post 9/11, that effort began. So here we are in 2018.
Yeah.
But the fact that they've got an app store that they're starting to move apps through, obviously we're in queue with that. I think that opens up exactly what you're talking to. Now my ability suddenly to grab some links from some cameras that are on-prem, have them hosted in the cloud, that ability, storage is a huge deal. That is a significant, I think it's something that Amazon and our partners at Trek 10 and others have clearly gotten a handle on in terms of driving down a major cost component of what's a deal breaker for these law enforcement officials. I talk with frequency that I've alluded to, the ability for body cameras to capture what is increasingly important and an expectation of that engagement with the end user, we'll call them victim, whomever. The problem is storage, right? So now we need to figure out how do we back up the storage bus alongside a FirstNet network, because you got multiple points of failure otherwise, right? It's like, hey, great story. I love the body cam. I love Playbook and its notification capabilities. But is it breaking down at the phone level? Is it breaking down at the cloud level? Or is it breaking down on the storage side? Storage side from a cloud perspective really should be a non-issue by my way of thinking. But lots of opportunities that a new network, I think, will enable, that schools that are racing desperately to solve this problem, I think they're going to uncover some of these things. The challenge is they're referencing the hours and hours spent looking at footage and listening in on these calls by respective governors. I appreciate the urgency, and I think that apolitically they are struggling because it's a horribly complex issue. It's not just one thing, and whether it's mental health professionals that they've convened, law enforcement that they've convened, Department of Education professionals that they've convened, the answer is somewhere in the middle. And it's a scary and frightening time, not only to be a parent, but even more so to be a child in our schools with some expectation that this just may happen. When I see quotes like that, my heart really sinks. I'm not suggesting that our product is necessarily going to save lives, but I absolutely believe it could contribute to saving lives. When I think about 911 tapes that I've been privy to listening, and people, this again, just quick anecdote, but somebody locked in a store, shopping center, manager's office who is on the phone with 911 and they're on the phone for 5 minutes, and at the 3-minute mark, the shooter has broken into their store and you hear them shot and you hear them expire on the phone. I know that if they had had the opportunity to reach out to people like the store mall manager, I believe the security director, create some type of commotion. I mean, that's part of the response, right? When you talk about run, hide, shoot, fight. Well, I'm not suggesting that, again, the outcome would have been entirely different, but you can't be on the phone for 7 minutes when you've got a shooter right outside your door. There has to be other things you can do, and part of that is accessing information. And I feel strongly about that. I think just it's simple contact information, but the reality is you and I have each other's names in our contact list because we know each other well. But you go to an event as a volunteer, you don't know half the people there, and yet you need to get a hold of that person who's out in the parking lot because something just occurred, or more likely vice versa.
Right. All right, we're a little bit over time, so I think I'm gonna wrap things up. Dude, this has been super topical, or timely maybe is the better word there. Super timely, and I appreciate how wide you let me take it in terms of some of the discussion. I think your product is important, and I thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. We'll do it again. Thanks, Mike.
If you're thinking of launching a SaaS product, Startup Competitors can provide data on your closest competitors, survey potential users, or provide other product validation services. Learn more at startupcompetitors.com.